Hello, Knox County students. My name is Jennifer Williams, and I teach at Gibbs High School. Welcome to KCS at Home Summer Edition. Today, we're going to focus on Task 2 of the Writing Workshop for English 4. But first, I need to make sure that you have completed the assignment so that we can work together. If you need the information, you simply need to go to knoxschools.org and click where it says See All Resources. This can be found under the KCS at Home logo. Now, I need you to complete the work before you continue with the video. So, if you need to pause the video and come back to it later, go ahead and do that. If you've already finished the assignment and you're ready to move forward, just keep watching. Task 2 focuses on argumentative response. Now, while we probably won't have time to write a full-blown essay today, what we can do is go over the elements of an argumentative response. You should have your finished work in front of you so that we can go over it together. And that way, if you have any questions or if you need to write down some comments, you have a place to do so. So, let's delve into argumentative response. The first thing we need to do is look at the learning targets. When it comes to argumentative response, this is what we hope you will learn. We hope that you will be able to write arguments to support claims in an analysis of substantive topics or text using valid reasoning and relevant and sufficient evidence. To produce clear and coherent writing in which the development, organization, and style are appropriate to task, purpose, and audience. To develop and strengthen writing as needed by planning, revising, editing, rewriting, or trying a new approach, focusing on addressing what is most significant for a specific purpose and audience. And like I said, we probably won't get to that part of the lesson. However, this is something you can take with you as you return to the classroom in the fall. Let's continue with the learning targets. Within this lesson, we want you to be able to use words and phrases and clauses as well as varied syntax to link the major sections of the text to create cohesion and clarify the relationships between claims and reasons, between reasons and evidence, and between claims and counterclaims. To demonstrate a command of the conventions of standard punctuation, capitalization, and spelling when writing. And finally, to apply knowledge of language to understand how language functions in different contexts, to make effective choices for meaning or style, and to comprehend more fully when reading or listening. So what's required when writing an argumentative essay? Writers and speakers use argumentative techniques to influence the attitudes and actions of an intended audience regarding a wide variety of issues. Effective argumentation involves conveying claims and counterclaims fairly and thoroughly, supplying the most relevant evidence for each, while pointing out the strengths and limitations of both in a manner that anticipates the audience's knowledge level, concerns, values, and biases. In this particular task, we're going to look at the elements that bring all this together. In your preliminary work, you were asked to answer 3 questions. Have you ever read an article online and then contributed to the comment section that follows? How familiar are you with public message boards, discussion threads, or online debates? What topics or comments inspire you to respond? So this isn't particularly focused on argument. However, it is focused on when you respond. So, what did you write down? Let's see if your answers match mine. They don't have to, but it's interesting to see where you might have met with mine. TV news sites. For example, Channel 10, 6, Channel 8, Channel 43. A lot of them will post their news stories online, and then below the news story, there's a place where you can make comments. Another place that you could possibly make some comments would be online newspapers like the Tennessean, the News Sentinel, Knox News, blogs, how-to videos on YouTube. For example, if you are trying to figure out how to make a birdhouse or change a tire, then there's a place where you can make comments to say, this video was great, it helped me a lot, or I couldn't see what you were doing. Online magazines are another place that you can write comments. And then troubleshooting message boards. If you're a person who knows how to tell me how to fix my broken mouse or why I can't get my Wi-Fi router to turn on, then post that on a message board, and that way somebody else can read it and you help them out. Educational articles, and then perhaps the most relevant is social media. So the platforms of Twitter and Facebook, that's where a lot of people will make a lot of comments on a variety of subjects. So what's happened is we've had the internet to be a place where people can discuss, debate, and even rant about controversial subjects. For most of these, there's nobody policing what you say. There's nobody telling you whether or not what you say is effective. So what our task today is to look at those elements of argumentative response. And with that, we're going to use the text of Ain't I a Woman by Sojourner Truth. Sojourner Truth was born a slave, but was able to live free in New York once slavery had been abolished. It is very apparent that she would become a supporter of emancipation and women's rights. The speech, Ain't I a Woman, is perhaps her most famous speech, and it was delivered in 1851 at the Ohio Women's Rights Convention in Akron, Ohio. Having read the speech, you should be able to see that it is a response to other comments or speeches that were made at that convention. Now, before we get to the actual speech, let's review one more time what it takes to write an argumentative essay. We're going to be looking for those argumentative techniques. Is she able to influence the attitudes and actions of her intended audience on a wide variety of issues? Is her argument effective because she is able to convey claims and counterclaims fairly and thoroughly? Does she supply the most relevant evidence for each while pointing out strengths and limitations? And most importantly, is she able to anticipate the audience's knowledge level, concerns, values, and biases? All of these factors are very important in having an effective argument. Now, one way to look at a text is to use the Soapstone Method. This method asks 6 questions. What is the subject? What is the occasion? Who is the audience? What is the purpose? Who is the speaker? And what is the tone of the piece? Now, what I've done is pretty much combined all these together so that you can have an overview of the speech itself. So let's look at the speech through a soapstone strategy. What is the subject? Sojourner Truth arguing that women should have the same rights as men. What is the occasion? The Women's Rights Convention in Akron, Ohio in 1851. Who is the audience? Women who wanted rights, blacks, attendees of the convention, and specifically the men who felt like women should not have the same rights as men. What was the purpose? To argue that women should have the same rights as men. The speaker, we know, is Sojourner Truth, but it should also be noted that Sojourner Truth in her own way is speaking for the women who wanted equal rights as well. And then finally, what is the tone? It's powerful, it's eager, it's honest, and in its own way, it's demanding. Now, while this is an overview of the speech, you should have read and annotated the speech for yourself. Your task was to look at the rhetoric, the colloquial language, as well as the claims and responses. What I have done is broken the speech into sections and then made my own highlights that I'll go over with you. So what I'd like you to do is to take out your work, lay it in front of you, and let's see how yours matches up with mine. You're free to make any notes that you want to make, make any comments, and we'll see how it ends up. Because remember, we're looking for an effective argumentative response. Ready? Let's go. The speech starts out with, "Well, children, where there is so much racket, there must be something out of kilter. I think that twixt the Negroes of the South and the women at the North, all talking about rights, the white men will be in a fix pretty soon. But what's all this here talking about?" What I've highlighted is the language that Sojourner Truth uses. She starts out by calling them children, and she doesn't mean this in a demeaning fashion. She actually means it in more of an endearing way, a way to make a connection with her audience. And then she makes it exceptionally clear who her audience is. She's talking to the Negroes of the South and the women at the North. She's also talking to the white men. And in some ways, that sets up a little bit of a combative audience. Let's move on to the second section. She continues with, "That man over there says that women need to be helped into carriages and lifted over ditches and to have the best place everywhere. Nobody ever helps me into carriages or over mud puddles or gives me any best place, and ain't I a woman?" You'll notice I have 4 different colors here. Again, I start with the yellow, meaning language. In this, she intends to point out that man. Again, separating one from the other. Then I have in the blue the claim that women need to be helped, that they are fragile, that they are weak. And then in purple, she has a response. She says, "Nobody ever helps me. Nobody gives me any best place." That's her response to his claim. And then she begins with the first of rhetorical questions of "Ain't I a woman?" Let's move on to the next section. As you can tell by the colors, this is mostly response. She starts off again with the language of "look at me." She makes a specific point to stop in her speech and have everyone look at her and focus on her. Remember what her intention is. Her intention is to argue against the claims of these men. So in purple, you have all of her responses. This is how she again continues to prove that women are not weak, that they are not fragile, that they are capable of great strength. So she says, "I plowed and planted and gathered. I could work as hard and as much as a man. I have borne 13 children and watched them be sold into slavery when no one heard me but Jesus." And throughout her response, she throws in those rhetorical questions to reiterate, "Ain't I a woman?" She moves on to the next claim. Then when they talk about this thing in the head, what's this they call it? And the member of the audience whispers, "Intellect." "That's it, honey. What's that got to do with women's rights or Negroes' rights? If my cup won't hold but a pint and yours holds a quart, wouldn't you be mean not to let me have my little half measure full?" In this, she points out with the language, this thing in the head. So she doesn't name it, but we do know what it is, and that's intellect. That's the thought process. Because the general claim is that women don't have the capability mentally to vote. And she calls him honey. It makes you wonder, is she talking to one of the men in the audience? Is this meant to be demeaning? And that's something that you can discuss with your teacher in class. But for the purposes of this lesson, the response comes back with, what's that got to do with women's rights or Negroes' rights? And perhaps her best feature of this particular section is the analogy she makes to, it doesn't matter whether you have a pint of something or a quart of something, there's still something in the jar. And wouldn't it be mean not to let me have it? Then Sojourner Truth moves on to the last claim. She says, then that little man in black there, he says women can't have as much rights as men because Christ wasn't a woman. Where did your Christ come from? Where did your Christ come from? From God and a woman. Man had nothing to do with him. I've again highlighted in yellow her language. That little man there. You'll have to go back in your notes and you can see how she talks about the men in the audience. And then she even focuses on where did your Christ come? Again, deliberate choice of language, because the women in the audience, especially who are Christian, are going to be able to resonate with that. And then there's the claim that women can't have rights because Christ was a man, not a woman. But she comes back with the response, but Christ came from God and a woman, and man had nothing to do with it. This is her way of responding and getting her point across, and I'm sure getting a few chuckles from the audience. She continues her response with, if the first woman God ever made was strong enough to turn the world upside down all alone, these women together ought to be able to turn it back and get it right side up again. And now they is asking to do it, the men better let them. This is her response to the fact that women are not weak. Women are strong. Women are capable. And the fact that she reverts to the Bible talking about Eve. This is her way to make a connection with the women of the audience and to show the men of the audience that women are capable of voting. Sojourner Truth ends her speech like this. Obliged to you for hearing me, and now old Sojourner ain't got nothing more to say. To me, this is one of the most powerful parts of her speech, because what she's able to do with this particular language and this particular ending is to say that women can be strong, they can be assertive and opinionated, but they can still be polite and gracious. So, looking at your notes, looking at your highlights, and any comments you've made, what we're going to do now is move on to the questions that you were asked to complete after you read and annotated the text. This question asks you to reread the lines you highlighted, then create a reversed outline of the 3 objections made to giving women the right to vote. Then, to outline briefly Truth's use of logic in response to the objections. So what I want you to do is to get your papers out and look and see how well yours match up to mine. Now remember, they don't have to be exactly the same, just make sure you're kind of getting the gist of what is involved. The first objection is women are weak and need protection, thus they cannot manage the burden of the vote. How does Sojourner Truth respond? She says, nobody ever helps me into carriages or over mud puddles. Look at me, look at my arm. I have plowed and planted and gathered into barns, and no man could head me. I could work as much and eat as much as a man. She basically says, I'm just as strong as a man. I don't need protection. I'm not delicate, and I'm not weak. The second objection, that women are mentally incapable of the vote. Her response, what does intellect have to do with rights? And I think that's one thing that's very, very interesting about the whole speech, is she kind of says, if we have a little bit of intellect, we have a little bit of intellect. No, nobody ever said you have to have more or less. Objection 3, women do not deserve to vote because they are not, like Christ, men. Her response, where did your Christ come from? From God and a woman. Man has nothing to do with him. Very, very logical response. The next question talks about the language. So how does Truth make effective use of language in the context of the speech? So look at what you wrote. Let's see how it compares to mine. Though Truth's diction is informal and may have been considered uneducated by her audience, this colloquial language underscores the fact that she speaks from the most ordinary of citizens, and that's very important. She seems to be consciously presenting herself as ill-educated when she says this thing in the head, what's this they call it, in order to further the point. Her word choices accentuate the fact that she is not delicate or frail. Now, the fact that she can speak in such a way denotes the fact that she is speaking more than just her one self, more than just her one woman, but she is speaking on behalf of many women. Perhaps one of the most evident pieces of her speech is the rhetorical effect of rhetorical questions. So I wanted to take a moment to have you review what is a rhetorical question and how to use it effectively. So one of the most notable features of Sojourner Truth's short speech is the repeated use of rhetorical questions. A rhetorical question is a question that is asked for rhetorical or persuasive purposes. This type of question does not actually attempt to inquire, but rather works to imply a point or message. The phrasing of the question forces the audience to a preferred answer while exposing an important point of contention. In Truth's speech, her repeated question, "Ain't I a woman?" draws attention to the idea that the opposing claims made about women are not accurate. Many of them do not apply to her, and yet she is a woman. Therefore, it is not gender alone that determines the truth of those claims, and the phrasing of the questions forces the audience to acknowledge the invalidity of the claims made by Truth's oppositions. So let's see what you wrote about the rhetorical language. When Truth repeats her famous rhetorical question, what is the effect and what is implied by the question? The effect of the repetition of "Ain't I a woman?" is to give added power as Sojourner Truth piles up logical rebuttals to the claim that women need physical help from men and are therefore incapable of voting. This is an illogical premise in the first place. The next question asks you, in the speech, Truth makes some strong points using very informal language called colloquial language. How does this affect her persona and further the points she's trying to make? To use informal colloquial language in such a forum situation shows that Sojourner Truth embraces her humble background and shows that despite her lack of formal education, she is capable of arguing logically as anyone in the room. In fact, she is more capable because her experience as a slave lends credibility to her arguments. So when it comes to writing, the one thing you need to think about is the language that you choose, the words that you choose, what emphasis are you trying to make, and how is it going to be effective to your audience? Now, at this point, you've read the speech, you've annotated the speech, we've gone over the speech, and we've broken it down into certain elements. The one thing that hasn't happened is you haven't heard the speech. And speeches are meant to be heard. So, I want you to listen to this rendition of Sojourner Truth's "Ain't I a Woman" speech, and I want you to hear the power of the words.
Well, children, where there is so much racket, there must be something out of kilter. I think that twixt the Negroes of the South and the women at the North all talking about rights, the white man will be in a fix pretty soon. But what's all this here talking about? That man over there says that women need to be helped into carriages and lifted over ditches and to have the best place everywhere. Nobody ever helps me into carriages or over mud puddles or gives me any best place. And ain't I a woman? Look at me. Look at my arm. I have plowed and planted and gathered into barns, and no man could head me. And ain't I a woman? I could work as much and eat as much as a man when I could get it, and bear the lash as well. And ain't I a woman? I have borne 13 children and seen most all sold off to slavery. And when I cried out with my mother's grief, none but Jesus heard me. And ain't I a woman? Then they talk about this thing in the head. What's this they call it? That's it, honey. What's that got to do with women's rights or Negro rights? If my cup won't hold but a pint and yours holds a quart, wouldn't you be mean not to let me have my little half measure full? When that little man in black there, he says women can't have as much rights as men because Christ wasn't a woman. Where did your Christ come from? Where did your Christ come from? From God and a woman. Man had nothing to do with him. If the first woman God ever made was strong enough to turn the world upside down all alone, these women together ought to be able to turn it back and get it right side up again. And now they is asking to do it. The men better let them. Obliged to you for hearing me. And now old Sojourner ain't got nothing more to say.
So let's review. Did Sojourner Truth have an effective argumentative response? Did she use argumentative techniques? She used rhetorical questions. She was able to influence the attitudes and actions of her audience. And she did cover a wide variety of issues. She was able to convey the claims and then have counterclaims that were fair and thorough, and she provided relevant evidence for each one, pointing out some strengths and weaknesses of both. Most importantly, what Sojourner Truth seemed to effectively do was anticipate her audience. She knew their knowledge level, she knew what their concerns were, their values, and she particularly understood their biases. So was her speech an effective argumentative response? So as we come to the close of our lesson, the good news is you've learned a lot of elements of argumentative response, and you can take these into your classroom when you go back to school in the fall. Now, I have a challenge. I want you to get out that opinion piece or that article that you were supposed to gather for this lesson. And I'm going to ask you, take that chosen piece and draft a well-crafted letter or essay in response to the ideas expressed in the piece. This is the criteria that I want you to look at as you begin to put that together. To create a reverse outline, just like we did with Sojourner Truth's speech. To brainstorm possible responses and evidence. Maybe conduct research if need be. Then make an outline. Determine the tone and persona, and we've seen how important that is. Then draft your introduction, body, conclusion. Don't forget your transitions. And then review your work. Revise it. Look for opportunities where you can exploit some rhetorical appeals, where you can promote your deliberate persona, and then finally edit from just those mistakes, spelling, punctuation, grammar, to produce a final draft. The challenge will be to write this and then take it back to the classroom in the fall. Now, before you do that final draft, here's one bit of advice. Look over the scoring rubric. It's part of the packet that was attached to the KCS at Home tab. What I have pulled out are the exemplary categories. So as you write your essay and then you finish, use these bullet points as goals. See if you can hit all of them, or at least most of them, in your writing. Then keep your writing, and perhaps you can share it with your teachers in the fall. I hope you've learned about the elements of argumentative response. You'll be able to employ these in the classroom when we return to school in the fall. Thank you for watching the video. Stay safe, stay healthy, and have a great summer.